such a modest coverage historically. But as you will see, there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. I've often had people say to me, why don't you do the mail in both directions? Well, frankly, doing the mail going out of Australia has kept me more than busy and more than broke for many years now. So I'm not about to start competing with the people who collect mail from other countries coming in. The Empire Email Scheme was the brainchild of bureaucrats in England. From as early as 1927, there had been significant agitation by postal reformers in Britain to reduce the email rate from 1 3/4 per half ounce to the surface rate of a mere penny halfpenny. Of course, for this to work on an empire-wide basis, it required the dominions to reciprocate. England could tell the colonies what to do, but the dominions tended to be a little more recalcitrant. In Australia, from December 1934, the all-up airmail rate from Australia to England was 1 6/6 per half ounce. However, the base internal air rate was 5p, so 2p letter rate per ounce, plus 3p airmail supplement per half ounce. It's fortunate that our generation still remembers how to calculate rates with pence and shillings, because I can tell you, if it was my kids or others of their generation who had to collect this stuff, they'd be scratching their heads. And that's even though it's all in English. The objection of an overseas rate being less than the domestic rate created a major obstacle to Australia's participation in any two-way budget scheme. The Empire Email Scheme, or Eams, as I'll refer to it from here on, was introduced in 3 stages from 1937. In the end, and I mean that literally, Australia was just about the last to sign up for it, Australia was persuaded to reduce the rate to 5p to match the internal rate, with only minor exceptions, and the enabling legislation was proclaimed on the 1st of July, 1938. Eames was controlled by the British government and the private company Imperial Airways. Between them, they decided that the so-called flying boats were preferable for the scheme than were land planes. In Australia, there was widespread scepticism about the viability of the scheme and, in particular, the use of the flying boats. In terms of diverting mail from shipping to carriage by air, the scheme was spectacularly successful. However, the volumes attracted soon exceeded capacity, causing a necessary reduction in the number of paying passengers, which made the service painfully unprofitable. Backlogs of mail put great strain on the viability of the service. Crashes and other incidents exposed the unsuitability of the rather fragile flying boats. An official review early in 1939 concluded that the logistics for Eames were fundamentally flawed, which the Australian end of the equation had worked out before it even started. Britain's declaration of war on the 3rd of September 1939, exactly 13 months after the first Eames flight from Sydney, saw the immediate and permanent suspension of the scheme, a return to pre-Eames rates, and perversely, a huge collective sigh of relief at Britain's Air Ministry and in the boardroom of Imperial Airways. Okay, so let's see how this works. Is that the enter button?
Yep.
Or is that the enter? That's the enter button. Okay. Officially, the scheme was inaugurated on the 1st of August 1938. The last mail at the Empire rate of 1 6p per half ounce departed Sydney per Circe, I think that's the correct pronunciation, on the 29th of July 1938. This cover from New Zealand to England was posted aboard a trans-Tasman ship. It was serviced through the Packbow section of Sydney's GPO on the 25th of July 1938 and the airmail section almost immediately. It was flown on the second last pre-Eames service per Coogee, which departed Sydney on the 26th of July. And you might say, well, if you're doing mail from Australia, why have you shown a New Zealand item to start with? And I do make an exception in this regard for mail that has been processed through Australia. So shipboard mail processed in Sydney or another Australian port qualifies for my collection. It's my collection, I make the rules. The flying boat route was much longer than a land plane route, requiring the craft to fly north along the New South Wales and Queensland coasts before cutting west across Cape York to Groote Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria and on to Darwin. For our overseas visitors, I am immediately realising that I should have had a map for you, but I hope that your general grasp of the essential geography of Australia is up to scratch. Being stamp collectors and postal historians, it will certainly be much better than most people. Most of the mail on the first flight, which departed on the 3rd of August 1938, was philatelic. This cover was prepared and self-addressed by Nelson Eustace. And I have to say, I'm not a big fan of philatelic covers in a postal history exhibit, but there are a few exceptions, and I think I've got one more coming. So please excuse me. Oh, there it is. No, I don't actually think this is philatelic. It's a fantastic cachet, but it says that the first flight was on the 4th of August. Apparently, it's from a government department in Canberra to New Zealand's representative in London, and it was carried on the 2nd service. Oh, this one's philatelic. Okay. Only the first 2 flights were on the original bi-weekly schedule. From the 3rd service on the 9th of August, the schedule moved to thrice weekly, which is commemorated by this cover. And if you realise that the first flight was on the 3rd, the second flight was on the 6th, the third flight was on the 9th, these envelopes were prepared very quickly. Somebody got the word that they were going to a thrice weekly service and managed to get out these rather attractive covers very promptly indeed. From the introduction of the Empire Service in December 1934, mail from Tasmania and Victoria, now you probably won't know this, was flown first to Adelaide to connect with Guinea Airways service to Darwin, where it connected with the through service from Sydney. This is a very scarce intermediate from Powell Creek in the Northern Territory. Powell Creek is 400 kilometres north of Alice Springs and 690 kilometres south-southeast of Darwin. It's about as remote as you can get. So I like that. I like this too. Mail from Western Australia was flown by the local McRobertson Miller Airways from Perth, essentially inland along the coast to Wyndham and then on to Darwin. This is a morning cover from Perth to Scotland, sadly not to their Perth, damaged in transit, probably after arrival at Southampton, where the labels were affixed. I'm sorry, they probably weren't. They would have been affixed on arrival at Glasgow, but the labels are found open or damaged and officially secured, and they're tied on the reverse and on the face there by Western DO or District Office, Glasgow, CDS. One of the things about collecting Eames covers is that 99% of them are 5-penny rates, and many of them have the George 5 5-pence, many of them have the 5-pence Ram, a smaller number have the penny and 2-pence King and Queen stamps, but they're all essentially boring. So one of the challenges with a subject that seems to offer very little scope is finding items that are out of the usual. And one of my collecting mantras in everything that I do is common items in uncommon circumstances. And I think you'll agree that a cover like this certainly qualifies for that. The letter rate, as I've said, was a flat fee of 5p per half ounce, which could be paid via a bulk postage account. Hence the Adelaide paid 5p slogan cancel here. Airmail saves time. And with the Eams scheme, it also saved money. Try finding another one with the machine cancel for a paid service. It's the only one I've ever seen. This cover is correctly rated at 10p for the double rate. So that's 5p per half ounce by 2. Going to London, redirected to Berkshire, then back to Southampton, where the flying boat base was located. So it had come into Southampton, been shot off to London, back into Berkshire, and then back to the base. No extra fees because it all happened pretty quickly. You sometimes see covers that have got the, in this case, British postage affixed, and it's not always apparent why that should be. There was a regulation that if the item was reposted more than 2 days after it was received, that additional postage had to be paid. But if you were prompt in readdressing the item and getting it back to the post office from which it had been delivered, it went on without any additional fee. Now, that was a standard double rate 10p, but there was apparently some confusion about sending overweight items. I'm not sure where, but I have seen an old reference to 5p for the first weight step plus 3p thereafter. But I'm almost certain it had to be an error. It may have been the intention, but it didn't happen. This cover was posted in the first month of the service and was paid 8p. And again, we have the appropriate slogan, airmail saves time. Now, he may have, the sender may not have intended it to be a double rate cover. It may have been intended to be registered, 5p plus 3p registration. That would explain the odd 3p. But in the absence of any indication to that effect, I think it's a short paid double rate that managed to avoid being taxed. Taxation should have been 4p, 2p for the deficiency plus 2p fine. Covers centred higher than double rate on the Eames service are extremely elusive. I have only 3 triple rate covers. And when I wrote this, I said nothing heavier, but I think I have got a 7 or 8 times rate quite recently. But that's quite attractive. I'm not a big fan of long covers, but if they look nice, I'll take them. Now we come to the really scarce stuff. Eames postcards are greatly underappreciated and underrated rarities. When Richard Brecken published his seminal work on Australian postage rates in 1988, he mistakenly stated the postcard rate was 4p halfpenny, thinking that it was a penny halfpenny, which was the normal letter rate, the normal postcard rate, plus 3p airmail supplement. That only proved that at that point he had not seen an example, and Richard's a very good collector, so for him not to have seen it and not to know about it indicates just how scarce these items are. In fact, the actual payment of 3p did conform to the UPU structure, under which postcards were charged at half the letter rate, rounded up to the nearest penny. So half 5p, 2p halfpenny, rounded up to the nearest penny, 3p. Obviously, the postcard rate was little used, probably because it cost only 2p more to send a letter, which was still less than a third of what it had cost prior to August 1938. Now, here we have the best item in the display. It's the only underpaid Eames postcard I have recorded. And the significance of it is really that it was actually flown. Departed Brisbane on the 22nd of February 1939, arrived at Portsmouth on the 6th of March, as proven by the date stamp on the 2p postage due. Now, if that had been diverted to the surface stream, I wouldn't find it anywhere near as interesting as the fact that it was actually flown. And the regulation in this respect was that if the payment that was actually made was half or more of the standard rate of the gazetted rate, then the item would be flown. and postage due charged on the deficiency. So that's exactly what happened here. So it is correctly handled according to the regulations. What I like about this most, apart from the fact that it's from the collection of Tilly Mitchell, which we sold last year, it's beautiful. But the best thing is that Tilly Mitchell, which isn't her real name, was given the card by a dealer who, like most traders, had absolutely no clue of its significance or value. When I bought it, I had no competition. You can check the catalogue. I'd estimated it at $1,000. I had no competition. I bought it for $750, which I still think was an absolute steal. And I spoke to a friend who also collects Eames seriously, and I said, I was expecting a battle royal from you. And he said, I just bought some other stuff overseas and I felt I'd stretched myself enough for the month. Well, that was my good fortune, because if it cost me 2 or 3 times what I paid, it certainly wouldn't have surprised me. Packbow mail could be flown to destination. This apparently social cover is quite extraordinary. Now, again, you know, it's 5pence rate cover. It doesn't look all that great, but it has got a packbow marking on it. It was posted aboard an arriving ship and processed through the ship mail room at the Melbourne GPO, where it was cancelled on the afternoon of the 1st of August, 1938, the first day of the newly gazetted Eames operations, and correctly paid 5pence, which raises the question, if it was posted aboard the ship, how did they know the correct rate? And I suspect that the rates had actually been transmitted to ships in the area by wireless or telegraph. And so here we have a cover that was prepared at sea in anticipation of the new rate, posted on the first day of the new rate. And Frank Power, that to me is a first day cover.
I agree, it is.
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, mail from Victoria was flown first to Adelaide, then on to Darwin, and it was probably received in time to connect with the inaugural outbound service per Carpentaria, which you have to remember left Sydney. The flights didn't start in Melbourne, they started in Sydney. So the idea was that you got at least a one-day advantage in flying to Adelaide and then directly north to Darwin. And it's almost inconceivable that with the efficiency of the operations in those days that it would have missed the flight. Today, of course, it could have taken 3 weeks to get to Darwin and nobody would say boo. Posted out of course. What on earth does that mean? My reading of it is that the letter was almost certainly placed by the sender into the wrong letter slip outside the Adelaide GPO, where it has been cancelled. It's the only out of course Eames cover that I have seen. And here we have a boring little registered cover. You'd think that registration, being only 3pence, would be a fairly common occurrence on a cover that cost only 5pence to send. But the registration of Eames covers is anything but common. This is a cracker. The Linfield date stamp, Linfield's a suburb of Sydney, is unusually in purple. Now, in Australia, we have a lot of violet ink cancels. Purple is more what you find in America, but this is definitely a purple cancel, so it's very unusual. And the destination is Penzance in Cornwall. It's easy enough to get covers going to London in any period. I like covers that are going to more out of the way places. The more out of the way, the better. If I can get it from an out of the way place as well, like that one from Powell Creek, then I get excited. Oh yeah. Okay. Even rarer are Eames covers for which other fees were paid. This is the only one I've seen with an additional 6pence for express delivery in London. Express delivery covers going overseas are not common at all, but you would expect that they'd turn up often enough, again, because the base rate was low enough to encourage it. But again, it's the only one I've seen. Oh dear, a flying boat, not flying anymore. One of the joys of collecting postal history is resolving mistakes that may go back generations. Tom Frommer, Henri Nellink, and Ken Sanford all accepted and repeated the historical error that Capella, yes, the boat in the photo, was lost on a flight from England. In fact, Capella was en route from Australia. On landing at Batavia, now Jakarta in Indonesia, she struck a submerged bollard and sank in shallow water. And you think, okay, it's going to happen. You're going to lose a boat. It was the sixth one to be written off. So they weren't doing terribly well. I would say in passing that Ted Proud actually got the direction of the flight correct, but he messed up the relevant dates. So I'm glad to say that we've got all of that sorted out now. Now here's a stock standard boring cover. 5p rate, ship mail room Melbourne, which was used for airmail until 1941, I think, from memory. So if you see ship mail room on an airmail cover, that's nothing unusual. What slide am I up to? There we go. Okay, so mail on the Capella was undamaged, which isn't much good if you collect crash mail, I have to say. I much prefer my crash mail to look like it's been in a crash. And as a result, it was delayed for only 24 hours. And the authorities therefore didn't endorse the envelopes, resulting in examples being hidden gems. It's only the third cover recorded from this incident. It's ex-Rodney Arthur Perry. I suspect there's quite a few of them out there. Oh yes, that's why it cost me a lot of money. The loss of Corinthian was Centurion. I've actually put Corinthian there. The loss of Centurion was an entirely different matter. A large mail was waterlogged when the flying boat was sunk by a gust of wind on the Hooghly River at Calcutta. There are numerous cachets and labels recorded on recovered mail. This is my second triple rate Eames cover, the 5 by 3p, 15p, 3 times 5p. The John Bull kit cachet, which was typical for these sorts of things, is Brian Peace's type N. And yes, he starts at A, so that's number 13. It has an inverted S in salvaged. But there's all sorts of fun things on the Centurion cachets. They're a little collecting area in their own right. In fact, they're probably the most common Eames covers because people kept them as crash covers. Okay, so the second one, actually, the cachet is similar style, but it says salvage mail ex Centuria. You didn't worry too much about spelling when you were doing wreck cover redemptions. This one's from Margaret River, south of Perth, so it would have been flown by McRobertson Miller up the coast to Wyndham and across to Darwin. Margaret River, as many will know, is the home or the home district of Australia's RDP, Raymond Todd. Good man, Raymond. Okay. The address on this one's not all that clear, but it's going to Singapore. Because of the heavy subsidies involved, the rates to all intermediate points along the route were the same as to England. But this cover to Singapore was paid 11p, seemingly a penny convenience overpayment of the double rate. But it's also being taxed. So 80 cents is 4p, so it was actually a triple rate cover that was underpaid. But there's, if we go to the back of it, there's the postage dues. And what I particularly like about this is it's a combination, franking, of straight settlements and Malayan Postal Union dues. And they're pretty scarce, pretty hard to come by. So it's a nice thing. Okay, this one's underpaid. In fact, when I first showed this Zoom presentation, somebody said to me, I think your cover to Bahrain is underpaid. No, it couldn't be. Got to be 5p. And I looked at it and I added it up. 1 plus 2. Yeah, that's 3. Okay, good. Bahrain, though, is one of the really outstanding Eames destinations. If somebody can find one for me paid at 5p, I'd like to acquire that. It's been paid at the postcard rate, so it should have been taxed 2p by 2, but there was no action taken on it. And the Karachi transit back stamp does prove that it was flown. Again, it was paid more than half of the 5p rate, and so the regulations provided that it would be flown. However, the regulations also provided that it should have been taxed. Another excellent Eames destination is Palestine. The mail was offloaded there on Lake Tiberias. This item is greatly enhanced by being usage of a registration envelope to a small settlement near Haifa. It's the only Eames registered cover to anywhere other than England that I have in my collection. This is a very busy cover to a ship's captain, care of the Peninsula and Orient, the P&O, at Port Said in Egypt. There was much chasing around to learn that the captain was not on board the Chitral, the Corfu, the Rampur, or the Viceroy of India. They certainly went out of their way to try and find the addressees back in those days. Here's the back of it. It was eventually forwarded to Thomas Cook and Son in London via Aden, where the transit back stamp was applied 2 months after its arrival in Egypt. So they weren't in any hurry, but they were certainly determined to do their best to find the addressee. To most Empire destinations that were not on the Eames route, there were no connecting air services. Mail was forwarded by surface without additional charge. This cover to Aden was most likely offloaded at Karachi and forwarded from there by sea. The hand stamp on the reverse, which I don't think I've actually got shown. No, I don't. There's a hand stamp on the reverse that shows it arrived after the departure of the Orontes. It was then forwarded to Italy, then to England, then back to Ceylon, and finally returned to Melbourne, all for 5p. That's getting value for your money, even if it wasn't delivered in a timely manner. There were 3 exceptions to the 5p per half-ounce rate, all to Empire destinations that were serviced by feeder air services. The all-up rate from Australia to Ceylon, travelling by air from Calcutta, was 7p. This rather busy cover, and I like back 2 covers, so this is rather pretty. It was, sorry, I've lost my place. It's to a passenger aboard the Orontes, again at Colombo. It was underpaid 2p, taxed 40 cents, converted to 24 cents on arrival. Please don't ask me how that was worked out. Yes, I can see that it has sticky tape stains, and if I was prepared to spend $400 or $500 US on it, I could get them removed. But frankly, I don't think it's worth that much. So sometimes you just have to accept a defective item. Here's the back of it. It missed the boat at Colombo, and so it was forwarded to Egypt, where 16 mils in postage dues was affixed, but endorsed refused, probably by the shipping agent, and it was written on in blue pencil. I don't know why people say blue crayon, when almost invariably it's a pencil that's being used. It was forwarded on to London, where the British postage dues 2p pair was affixed, but again it was refused, and returned to Traralgon in the Latrobe Valley. Now, I'm yet to see an Eames cover to Ceylon paid at the correct 7p rate. I have 2 others that were underpaid 2p and that were similarly taxed. There was a similar situation for Malta, to which the all-up rate from Australia by air from Cairo was 6p. Now, it was a penny less than for the Ceylon ones because the feeder air service was much shorter. But again, I'm yet to find a correctly rated article. I think people assume that all Empire destinations were payable at 5p. And so that's what you invariably see. This cover was underpaid a penny, taxed 20 cents, converted to tuppence because they were using the British currency, and with the Maltese postage due affixed on the face, which was very well thought out by the postal people. But to add insult to apparent injury, hang on. No, I skipped one again. Dear, oh dear, I should have marked this up better, shouldn't I? This March 1939 cover was apparently paid at the old Empire rate of 1 6p plus registration. However, there is a slight chance that it was paid at the correct triple rate of 6p per half ounce, 1 6p, plus 3p, in which case it would be correctly rated. But I really don't think so. I think that's a stretch. I find a lot of collectors are very optimistic about their own material.
Yeah.
And I've been guilty of this myself, but I've tried wherever possible to be objective about things and look at it from the point of view of somebody else who might say, no, you're kidding yourself there, Gary. Anyway, as I was saying, to add insult to apparent injury, it was flown through to Brindisi instead of offloaded at Cairo, and then it was forwarded from Italy by sea. So not only was it way overpaid, they didn't get the basic service that was being sought. Now, here's something our English friends will probably know, but it's unlikely that our Australians will know. Even though Ireland was granted autonomy in 1922, I think it was 22 or 23, for postal purposes, Ireland continued to be considered part of Great Britain. Really. Check it if you like. True. Now, mail for Empire destinations beyond England. So we've done destinations coming into England, but now we've reached England, we're going beyond there. Mail for Empire destinations going beyond England was forwarded by ship without extra charge. This cover is to a ship's passenger at Gibraltar. And you might think, why wasn't it offloaded at Marseille and sent from there? Surely it would have been quicker than going to London and then being sent back. But you have to remember that France is not an Empire destination. And I think it would be fair to say that a lot of people in Europe and other places that weren't able to participate in the cheap airfares or rates available to Empire people were quite miffed, particularly at the thought they might be expected to forward an item onto a British possession without getting any compensation for doing so. So this is almost certainly, 100% certainly gone through to London and then been put on the ship back to Gibraltar, where inevitably it missed the ship. So it was sent back to London, back to the Tilbury docks, which is what the blue cachet below the stamp says. And then presumably it was sent to Miss Cunningham's home address in Edinburgh. At the time, Britain, this is not the first cover, this is another example of the first cover. At the time, Britain had no scheduled transatlantic air services to Canada, which was therefore excluded from Eams. So there were no flights between Canada and England. In fact, the Americans had only just started transatlantic services. They, of course, were not in the Empire, and so Eames didn't apply to them either. Again, we have an inaugural flight cover from Adelaide. And if you look below the printed part of the cover, you'll see a hand stamp that reads Australia to England. Now, it's been suggested many times that hand stamps like this were private, that they were owned by collectors or that they were used by companies. I can absolutely guarantee you that they are official post office markings. They were used when there was no superscription or when the superscription was incomplete or wrong, or when the postal clerk simply couldn't read Australia, England at the top of the envelope. Until 1949, Newfoundland was a separate colony from Canada. Only joined the Dominion of Canada in 1949. This cover is between members of the Ligo de Pals, as endorsed at the upper left. That's Esperanto. Guess what? League of Pals, or pen pals. Pen pal clubs were a big deal back in the 1930s, and there's a tremendous amount of mail between pen pals in this period, and of course right up until we were all kids in the 60s and 70s, all right, the 40s and 50s for some of you. Yeah. The parallel Jusquois bars, the red bars across the airmail label, were applied at London to indicate that air service terminated in England, and the cover was forwarded by sea. Jusquois is translated from the French as meaning as far as. So it's gone as far as London, copped the Jusquois bars, and onwards by sea. Now, the same situation of forwarding from London at no extra fee applied to mail going to the West Indies. This is a 1938 cover to the well-known stamp dealer Barrington Smith in Jamaica, again with the Jusquois bars and the halfway tree arrival back stamp, which indicates a very respectable transit time from Sydney of only 24 days. Not bad at all. Some people might say this is a philatelic cover. I demur. I think whenever an order goes to a stamp dealer or a payment goes to a stamp dealer, that's commercial mail. I have absolutely no problem with that sort of thing, unless it's over-franked, unless it's got silly stamps on it, labels that don't belong, all that sort of stuff. Or most first day covers, apart from the one that I had earlier. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, wherever possible, I like covers to and or from small post offices. This cover is from Melbourne, so stock standard, but it was sent to Palo Seco, an oil town on Trinidad, some 90 kilometres south of the capital port of Spain. So if you've ever been to Trinidad, it's a good hike down there because the roads aren't much chop even today. Okay, this is something a bit different. Occasionally, attempt to pay an incorrect 5p rate was understandable because of political considerations. So this cover from Queensland is addressed to the BPO, or the British Post Office, at Tangier in British Morocco. That would have caused the French some consternation. England had a post office at Tangier for sure, but Morocco was definitely French territory. So the cover was held at the Brisbane GPO for additional postage, with the George 5 1 and 4p stamp being affixed the next day. So we now have the correct foreign airmail rate of 1 and 9p to France. The Jusquois bars in black were applied at Marseille, and the cover was forwarded across the Mediterranean by sea. It begs the question why, if it was correctly paid to France, which was also the correct rate to the French possessions in North Africa, it wasn't flown on from Marseille, but that probably has something to do with the British Morocco. Covers to the United States were sometimes paid at the 5p Eams rate, probably in the expectation that they would be forwarded from London without additional surcharge. But no, as I said earlier, the Americans were not party to the scheme. The correct rate was 1 and 7p, 1 and 6p to England, plus a penny for the transatlantic service. Because less than half of that amount was paid, this cover was marked not eligible for aerial mail and was sent to America by sea, presumably trans-Pacific, but there's no way of knowing that. You'll note that this is Sydney hand stamp number 1 for that purpose. Sydney hand stamp number 2 is on this cover. In this instance, the sender apparently thought that by paying the Eames rate to England, plus threepence for the full foreign surface rate from Australia, he'd get the cover sent by air to England and then on by sea. That didn't happen. Nice try. Here we have a cover that was correctly paid to England at the 5p rate, and there was no reason why it couldn't be on forwarded to a foreign destination, but additional postage was required. This cover to Haddington in East Lothian was redirected to Switzerland, but it was not taxed and there was no postage due collected. The surface rate from Britain to Europe was twopence, but it appears that the National Bank of Australasia added just 1 penny to this cover to get it to Germany. Again, it wasn't taxed. Now, I wonder if I'm missing something here. Was there a redirection fee at this time of only a penny to a foreign destination? And perhaps our British friends could help on that, or maybe I should ask Ken Snelson, who I was talking to earlier today, on a Zoom call to Canada. Okay, of course it couldn't all last. As I said earlier, the service was running at tremendous losses. There were great backloads of mail, and declaration of war was a blessing in disguise in respect of being able to terminate the service. So on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Germany. The Empire Airmail scheme was suspended, a euphemism for cancelled, and pre-August 1938 rates were reinstated. But it appears that there was some leniency given in the first few days of wartime conditions. This cover was posted 2 days later on the 5th of September at the Sydney GPO, where one would expect that the correct rates were well known, but it was not taxed and was apparently sent by air. Mail posted at the Eams rates after war was declared was supposed to be diverted to the surface stream. However, some was flown, but taxed. This 13th of October cover to Singapore was paid only 5p, but that was more than the pre-Eams rate of, more than half of the pre-Eams rate of 9p, and so it was flown. It was taxed 80 cents, converted to 39 cents Malayan currency. Why? I don't know. With Malayan Postal Union 3-colour postage due franking. And if you see this cover again, that hole will have disappeared. Now this cover, yes. So that cover was only 4p underpaid, and that's why it was flown. But this cover from 19th of October, so we're now talking 7 weeks after the declaration of war, or 6 weeks, going to the Midlands, was underpaid 1 and a penny. There's no way known that it should have been flown, and yet it obviously was. No accident, because it was taxed 260 centimes at Melbourne. There are no dedicated markings for such high fines at either end, and so the 260 had to be written in by hand. The British postage dues cancelled on the 3rd of November confirmed that the 15 days transit time was definitely by air. And there endeth the lesson. Thank you for your attendance. I hope it's been interesting. I hope you've learned something from it. I hope none of you were bored senseless. Thank you.
I can stop sharing the screen.
Stop sharing the screen. There we go. How's that?
There you go.
Oh, now I can see other people.
There you go. Okay. Thank you very much, Gary. I think that was excellent. I didn't notice there was so many Eames covers around.
Thanks,
now,
Gary.
can I get Gary Diffin? Do you want to come up the front, Gary? Go see where Gary is.
Yep.
To give the vote of thanks.
I can get a vote of thanks.
Yeah.
It's a good day. Out I get. Oh, gosh, I'm being evicted.
You are.
All right. There you go. As long as they can see me getting my plaquette.
Well, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. You're being passed over from one Gary to another. Now, I've got to admit that I know less than nothing about these covers. But the good thing about this is that government, what would you call it? Stupidity doesn't take long to get there. I collect, for me, it's ship mail from the Australian colonies. There was a lot of government stupidity in the early 1850s, and it's good to know that by the 1930s, nothing had changed. But the thing is, you know, even though I've known nothing about what we've presented here today, there's a lot of similar themes to what I collect and to what you see here. The Eams scheme, even though it only lasted 13 months, is very similar to some of the other things that have happened in previous, in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, etc. The thing I loved about the way that Gary took us through this is the passion, because the passion to collect this thing came through in the presentation. And it's great to see passionate people, because that's what makes our hobby so much better than what it is to other people. There were things here that I really enjoy. You don't have the bog standard 5-pence covers. Here's some other covers demonstrating different parts of the service. And these can be uncommon items, things that have got underpaid mail, things that are going through stopovers, forwarding on. There was a lot of things that came through here. It's not a standard service. And it's a lot of things that make, or a lot of covers that actually make up the story of what this presentation was here tonight. So for me, this was really, really interesting. One of the things I did like was that crash cover that looked in pristine condition. Gary said that it looked really nice. I could help make it unnice if you want. and bring it into a crash condition. I'll do this free of charge, mind you. But the thing here is that from my perspective, it was a really interesting display on what could be a very common item. And the thing is, the more when you collect something, you look for things that are outside the normality of what you collect. And here you're able to tell a story, and a very, very good story, of how people were writing from Australia to London, to foreign destinations, and how the postal rates changed and how different things changed on the way through. So for me, even though I'm pretty much a virgin as far as this type of collecting is, or not sorry, not collecting.
So Virgin Airways.
Yes, I am surrounded by him. It's such a great display, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. So if you can give us a hand of applause, I think it's well deserved.
Well done. There's one thing thanks Gary, that was great. One thing I forgot, was there any questions in the room? And the guys in the Zoom land, do you want to if you want to ask any questions, do you want to put them in the chat and I can read them out to Gary?
Well, they've got to type them in. No, of course not.
Can you hear me, Gary? Graham Howard here. Gary, yeah, Gary, you commented earlier on about the crashes of the flying boats and things, and you get the impression, because I've looked at these sort of things from the other direction, and you do get the impression that there were a lot of crashes and things. But what surprised me when I got into the detail of it was when you look at all the schedules in Proud's books, you realise just exactly how reliable the service was over those from 1937 onwards. And when you take into account the number of landings that they had to do on the way, because, you know, they had, what, 16 or 17 stages to get to Australia. In actual fact, it's really remarkable that they completed so many flights so reliably.
Yeah, I agree with you, Graham. But you know, I will relay the question. Graham's asking, commenting on my suggestion that the flying boats were a bit of a disaster by saying that there were thousands of flights with very few losses. And I was going to suggest to Graham that you don't ruin a good story with accuracy. It's certainly true that the majority of the flights ran to a pretty tight schedule. But if you were to study Proud's book in particular, there were hundreds of incidents through this period. Everything from getting caught up in a dust storm in Iraq to having a flat tire in India, and having to be towed across the harbour in Batavia, and all sorts of things that went on that aren't evident from the covers themselves. But of course, that's one of the things that intrigued Rod Perry, and he chased after covers that he proved were on various flights with a passion. And yeah, look, the flying boats were certainly more suited to the task than the Australians expected them to be. But the fact is that if it had been more of a land-based service, I think it would have been even more reliable and quicker.
Okay, there's a couple of questions here. Mike Desirio has asked, how long have you been collecting this material?
Okay, well, it's a simple question. The answer's not so simple. I've been collecting destination mail seriously for about 20 years. Eams is a subject that came onto my radar a lot more recently. And when I understood the significance of it, then I started looking at what I had. And I found that I did have some Eams covers, but I didn't have a clue what they were all about. In fact, when I started this collection, it was really all about the destinations. And my initial goal was to get one attractive commercial item going to every possible destination. And then somewhere along the way, it didn't take very long, maybe a year or two, I realised that I was becoming a de facto postal historian, and the routes and the rates and all the rest of it just became overwhelming. So once I twigged to the notion that there was this cut price service for only a year just prior to the war, that really piqued my interest. And I started going after the material with some intent. And I bought virtually every Eames cover that I found, except those that are just standard company rates. So, as Frank said, he didn't know there were so many Eames covers around. Outside of my collection and my friend up in Sydney, from Australia, yeah, there's not many. Yeah. Not many good ones.
All right. Ian Greggs asked, for the letters sent by ship as underpaid, why were there no double bars on them?
Well, the Jusquois bars were applied only to airmail covers. So they were flown to the point at which the service terminated, in most cases London, but as we saw also Marseille, and they could also be applied in places like Cairo or even Singapore. So where the airmail service terminated is where the Jusquois bars were applied, and then the item went on by surface. If it went surface all the way, if it was intended to be an airmail cover but was diverted to the service stream, then there was no airmail service involved and no need for the Jusquois bars. That's a purely airmail function.
This is not a question, this is a comment in regards to this. Great that you can run this meeting. This is by Jürgen. Great that you can run this meeting in hybrid format, allowing international members to join in. I'm trying to convince the board of my traditional home club to adopt this meeting format. Unsuccessful so far. Very well done from your side. Thanks a lot.
And danke, Jürgen. I must say, I'm not surprised that you've got that resistance, because the very first time I went to Germany was in the mid-1980s, and I was absolutely staggered that nobody accepted credit cards. So the uptake for Zoom, yes, I expect it might take a little bit longer.
All right, any more questions in the room? What about out in Zoom land? No? Oh, one from Mark Desiro again. Are the French Jusquois in black because the British used red?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever turned my mind to that. I suspect that there could be something in it, Mark, but I think that's a research project that I'd encourage you to undertake. There is actually a book on Jusquois markings. It's about 300 pages, and you would be astonished at how many different Jusquois markings there are from all around the world. They're not all nondescript or anonymous like the bars. In fact, those Australia to England, Australia to Greece, those types of markings that I commented on earlier, they are considered by some collectors to be Jusquois markings, even though I don't agree with that. But they are included in the Jusquois book. Please don't ask me who wrote it, I can't remember. But if you're interested in second 20th century airmails, Yeah, well, I suppose you could have 21st century ones. couldn't you?
Yeah.
If you're interested in airmails, it's a book that I highly recommend because it's a subject that's little understood. And if you want to send me an email, I'll happily send you the details of the book.
All
And
right.
don't tell me you haven't got my email address because it's on the inside of every Abacus auction catalogue.
Oh, there's a plug and a half. I think I'll be sending a bill to Abacus for this. All right, as no more questions, all right, then it leads me to the presentation of the plaquette. I think Gary, marvelous job. Like I said, I haven't seen a so, you know, and I do collect emails a lot, and I haven't seen that many Eams covers probably in my lifetime. So well, very well done. And I know you're a very good researcher and a very good collector. So you know, it's no wonder that's such a good collection. So thank you very much, and on behalf of us all, well, congratulations.
Oh, we're doing a scout check. Thank you, Frank. Thank you all.
All right, now I'll stop recording. So then we don't need to do the rest of the